Hello and welcome to another edition of our book study. We are now in Chapter 5 of Irresistible by Andy Stanley. And judging by the way the last two chapters went, you might want to grab some liquid sanity with me. It's been pretty bad. But this is the last chapter in Section 1 of this book. So it's actually kind of a longer chapter. We'll see how far we get into it. I may have to split it into two parts, the same way that I split Chapter 1 into two parts. But we'll see how far we get in it. This chapter is called Recentering the Universe. Oh boy. Getting into it, let's see. He says, perhaps the most prominent narrative theme in the Gospels, the four accounts of Jesus' life, is the incessant conflict between Jesus and religious leaders. Of course, this is where we're going. Let's see exactly what he goes with here, because understand, not every situation that has been presented as conflict actually is. And I'm sure that I'll go over those in some kind of lesson at some point. While it's easy to identify where they differed in perspective and interpretation of the law, it's not as easy to wrap our minds around why these differences caused the Pharisees, Sadducees, and teachers of the law to hate Jesus. They couldn't agree to disagree with him. They hated him. They didn't just wish him dead, they orchestrated his arrest and execution. While that seems a bit over the top to us, as it did to Pilate, they actually had good reason to despise him. So again, the mingling of Pharisees and Sadducees, and then separating somehow teachers of the law, that would be the Pharisees. You can't conflate the two. They were enemies of one another. They had almost entirely opposite philosophies. And the Sadducees didn't accept the whole of the text of Scripture the way that the Pharisees did. Let's see. They saw what we miss. Temple leaders did not view Jesus as Judaism 2.0. They rightly understood Jesus to be a threat to everything they valued. Everything. If what he claimed was true, it signaled the end of, not a new version of, the world as they knew it. All right. Right, so he's trying to present Jesus as being an end of Judaism, and not just Judaism 2.0. I agree that Jesus didn't come here to start Judaism 2.0. He just came here to practice Judaism, like as it was. But this is a common problem of Christianity, because a lot of Christians and a lot of Christian pastors have not done enough history, and haven't done enough Jewish history in particular, or even research into Judaism in general, to know that Judaism as it existed in the days of Jesus' ministry was not the same Judaism that existed before Jesus' lifetime or even after his lifetime. It is an isolated window of Jewish leadership that saw this style of Judaism. The reality is Jesus was teaching Judaism in every possible way. There isn't a single thing that he taught that wasn't originally Jewish. Matter of fact, most of his teachings very specifically align. I know I've said this before, and you guys should know this by now. I'm probably kicking a dead horse, but most of his teachings align with that of Rabbi Hillel, who came before Jesus. And this same Rabbi Hillel had a halakha that was accepted over that of Shammai after the time of Jesus. Shammai had a brief window of majority popularity that happened to fall during Jesus' lifetime within his ministry. So these are things that we can't discount when we're reading these altercations. The historical context and cultural context is paramount. Because no, Jesus didn't come to start Judaism 2.0, and he definitely didn't come to start a whole new religion. He came to maintain Judaism. Okay, modern Bible readers see Jesus as an extension of the Jewish scriptures, our Old Testament. Jewish leaders in Jesus' day didn't see him as an extension or fulfillment of anything. We see Jesus as an and. His first century detractors saw him as an instead of. Also not true. I suppose you could say instead of if you're talking like Hillel instead of Shammai, then you can make that argument, but no. That's not what he's intending, and just no. Let's see. On this point, they were correct. Jesus was introducing something new. There is nothing new under the sun. That statement has never been more true. One of Jesus' most offensive statements is recorded in Matthew's Gospel. If you've read it before, chances are you kept on reading. Few of us even notice it. During one of his many squabbles with religious leaders over what entailed a violation of the Sabbath, Jesus referred to himself, stated, "I tell you that something greater than the temple is here." Infuriating, right? No? Never noticed that statement before? Didn't think so. Right. So we're going to stop right there, and we're going to go over a little bit of Jewish halakha. Because no, he does say something greater than the temple is here. He is not referring to himself, and there's absolutely no way in the passage that we can actually derive that he is very specifically referring to himself. No. He's referring to Matthew 12, okay? Matthew 12, I'm going to summarize this passage for you real quick. Matter of fact, let me get a placeholder in the book. Matthew 12. The disciples are hungry. They are plucking grains of wheat to eat, right? This is being done on the Sabbath, plucking grains of wheat on the Sabbath. Okay, so this constitutes harvesting. Whether or not you think it does is irrelevant. Halakhically in Judaism, that is harvesting. You have picked wheat. It is wheat that is growing in a field, and you have now harvested it. Okay? It's a very literalist interpretation. Again, Shammai was an extreme literalist when it came to application of interpretation of the Torah, right? And how to interpret mitzvot. So, yes, they were harvesting. His disciples, or the Pharisees, come to him and ask him, "Why do your disciples do that which is not lawful on the Sabbath?" So, he doesn't tell them they're wrong. Notice that about the passage. He doesn't say, well, no, you're wrong. They're not violating the Sabbath. He doesn't. He acknowledges it. He even dignifies it, right? But here's what he does. He builds a Talmudic case for what we call pikuach nefesh, right? The preservation of life. So what he does is he builds this case by explaining how the priests in the temple are constantly breaking the Sabbath, right? Because some of their duties are continuous, right? Very particularly the continually burnt offering, right? That is continuously burnt. So something has to be constant. Somebody has to constantly be working to keep that going, and even on the Sabbath, right? So what he's illustrating here is that in God's economy there are jurisdictions of law, okay, and there are levels of weightiness to certain laws, okay. And so certain jurisdictions of law supersede others. So temple law supersedes that of Sabbath law, right? How do we know this? Well, the things in the temple that are continuously done, even on the Sabbath, are not seen as violations of the Sabbath. Why? Well, because temple law supersedes Sabbath law, okay? Then he goes to another example. This one where temple law is being violated, right? He speaks of, I think it is recorded in 2 Samuel 22, 1 Samuel 22. It's where David goes into, so Jonathan tells him, I'll fire my arrow. If I fire it short, then you can come back. If I fire it long, you got to leave, right? Because my dad wants to kill you. So from there, David goes. He goes into the city, he goes into the temple, and he asks for food to eat. And the priest tells him there is no bread to eat except this showbread, the consecrated bread intended for the temple. It's forbidden for anyone to eat except the priests. But he gives it to David. David eats it, and this is not seen as a violation. Why? Well, David was hungry, right? He had human need, hunger, and eating. Eating is considered protecting of life, right? Now, there's debate on exactly how extensive the hunger has to be for it to qualify as pikuach nefesh. Some would say that you have to be on the brink of starvation, right? You have to be at the point where you will literally die if you do not get this food. And then others much more lenient, that simply because you need food in order to live, the simple act of eating in general, when you are hungry, is protecting this life, as it is feeding your life force and keeping you going. It would seem that Yeshua took this position, because we can't really derive from this narrative that his disciples were starving. I doubt they were. But, they may have been. We don't know. There's no indication as to the severity of their hunger. But it's highly unlikely that they were starving to death. So what do we learn from these that Jesus gave, right? What the Christian churches will teach you on this is that he just pointed out several other examples where people broke the law and it was okay, so it's okay to break the law, right? That's what they're trying to draw out to you, is that, well, it's okay to break the law because these guys are breaking the law and that guy's breaking the law, and so everybody can break the law, right? Because something greater than the law is here. Jesus! It's not what he's building. That's far too simplistic. It's almost childish in the way that it comes out. No, what he is explaining is that within the jurisdictions of these laws, human need and protecting it, pikuach nefesh, supersedes that of temple law, right? Which supersedes Sabbath law, ergo, human need supersedes Sabbath law, right? That's the case that he built. It's a legal case, and you can even find this ruling, not the particular examples, but you can find this ruling. The rulings on pikuach nefesh, you can find them in the Talmud. To the point where actually even in the movie The Possession, which is a movie about a demonic possession, well, not even a demonic possession. It's not a demon, it's a dibuk, which is something else, is something different. But it's about a Jewish exorcism, where most of the movies you see about exorcisms, it's always Catholicism. It's always the Catholic priest who's casting out this evil spirit. But in this one, it's a Jew. And this Jew is played by Matisyahu, who was once a Hasidic Jew. He's gone off the path a little bit now. He's living a more secular life. I think maybe his fame as a pop star and a reggae artist may have influenced that decision a little bit. But in any case, it's brought out in this movie, right? He explains that he is going to go and help this man and try and exorcise this spirit from his daughter, even though it's the Sabbath. And he explains that because a life is in danger, it's not just that he's allowed to violate the Sabbath in this aspect, but that he is actually commanded to. He is mandated to go and help because a human life is in danger. That's a Talmudic ruling. That's a Jewish ruling. So that's what Yeshua is actually referring to here, is this issue of human need superseding the Sabbath. So when he's saying something greater than the Sabbath is here, he's not talking about himself. He's talking about the situation at hand, hunger, human need. That is the situation here. That is the something being spoken of, not himself. If he were speaking of himself and saying, well, I'm greater than the Sabbath, so I can break all the rules that I want, he could not be Messiah. That's an automatic disqualification. Cannot be Messiah. Cannot happen. So, glad we cleared the air on that. let us continue. For first century Jews, nothing and no one was greater than the temple. Oh, Lord. If there was something greater than the temple was pointless, useless. While there are places we consider special, perhaps sacred, our emotional connection with those places pales in comparison to how Jews felt. In some cases, still feel about their temple. For first century Jews, the temple was everything. It was the center of the world, not just their world, the world. He's not wrong in the viewpoint, but he's being a little too diminutive of it because, again, this is not something that Yeshua is actually... he's arguing against a point that's not even being made. Again, Yeshua doesn't say something greater than the temple is here in terms of like actual value in these terms. We're talking about precedence of importance regarding the obedience of commandments. He's arguing something that is well out of the context of the passage. Let's see. The temple was the epicenter of Jewish religious life. It was the official home of the official law. The temple was the presence of God on earth. To compare oneself to the temple or suggest anything was greater than the temple reflected extraordinary arrogance, ignorance, or insanity. Again, that's not what was being done, so we're laboring an inconsequential point. For someone to be greater than the temple was blasphemy worthy of death. Right, and if that were the statement being made, the Jews would have been perfectly justified in executing him. They would not have been wrong. But that's not the statement being made, and that's why they didn't even attempt it. A threat to the temple was a threat to the nation. The Jewish populace would die before allowing this sacred real estate to be desecrated or threatened. Die. That's not hyperbole. Case in point. Actually, if you read the siege of Jerusalem and how that went, even though they lost, the defense that they put up was incredible. I'm talking using techniques in war that were unprecedented for their time. Things that were continued to be used up into even the 1800s. Certain techniques that were employed there were still used in war. Let's see. This next section is called Idle Talk. Around the year AD 40, citizens of Jerusalem were notified that a statue of Emperor Gaius Caligula was to be erected within the temple walls. Petronius, governor of Syria, was given the responsibility for transporting the statue from the port city of Ptolemais to Jerusalem. He was accompanied by 2 legions, approximately 10,000 soldiers. When they arrived to take possession of the statue, he was shocked to discover thousands of Jews from the region had gathered to protest. When threatened with violence, instead of organizing to defend themselves, the protesters knelt and exposed their necks to the Roman blades. The message was clear. They would die before they witnessed their temple defiled. Petronius was outmaneuvered. Armed conflict was one thing. Slaughtering unarmed citizens was something else entirely. Ignoring the crowd, Petronius and his legions made their way inland to Tiberias. According to Josephus, upon reaching Tiberias, he was met with an even larger contingency of protesters. He was still over 100 miles from Jerusalem. Josephus described the scene outside Tiberias this way. So they threw themselves down upon their faces and stretched out their throats, and said they were ready to be slain. And they did this for 40 days together, and in the meantime left the tilling of their ground, and that while the season of the year required them to sow it. Thus they continued firm in their resolution, and proposed to themselves to die willingly rather than to see the dedication of the statue. Farmers throughout the region, okay, so this is no longer Josephus's quote. Farmers throughout the region went on strike, putting the economy of the region in jeopardy. Once again, Petronius found himself at an impasse. To fulfill the emperor's wishes would require something far worse than armed conflict. It would require something closer to genocide. Reluctantly, he wrote the emperor asking for further instruction. Fully aware of his failure to carry out his orders would be interpreted as incompetence, and would no doubt result in his removal, or worse. In an extraordinary twist of fate, the Providence, officers of the Praetorian Guard conspired with a handful of Roman senators to have the emperor assassinated before Petronius' letter reached the capital. Crisis averted. So yeah, the temple was a big deal. Jesus claimed to be greater than the temple. That was a problem. Well, the problem is Jesus didn't claim that. Again, this is a terrible interpretation of that passage. This next part is called Model Flaws. By the time Jesus reached adulthood, the Jewish temple system was completely corrupt. He thought so anyway. While we're introduced to a smattering of sincere priests, lawyers, and Pharisees in the Gospels, they are the exception. Jesus' trial alone is enough to remove any doubt of the state of the state. So no, that is not a true statement. The priesthood was corrupt. Yes, the priesthood was an illegitimate priesthood. It's funny, actually. I heard one Christian pastor talk about the priesthood, and he's specifically referencing this priesthood because it was like an Easter Sunday, and we're talking about Jesus' trial and how the high priest was there. And so he's talking about how this high priest was a descendant of Aaron, and I'm like, wow, guy, like, you're a pastor. You should have done this history. You should know better than this. Because the priesthood was illegitimate. It was no longer sons of Aaron who were acting as priests. It was people who purchased the position, more or less. But it's interesting how even in spite of an illegitimate priesthood, Jesus still acknowledged and honored the office. And that's why even when he healed a leper, what did he tell him? Go and submit yourself to the priests, be inspected by them, because the priest is the only one who can declare you clean. Like, just because you no longer have leprosy that's visible on your body doesn't make you clean. You're not clean until the priest declares you clean. Just like you don't technically have leprosy until the priest declares you to have leprosy. You can have leprosy, but until you've been to the priest and had him inspect you, you don't actually have it until he declares it. His word basically materializes the condition, or maybe not even materializes, because it would have certainly manifested, and that's why you went to the priest to be inspected. But it is not set in stone until his word sets it in stone. Likewise, even the condition of being clean from leprosy, because biblical leprosy is not Lou Gehrig's disease the way we understand today. That disease did not exist at this time, so far as we know. Tzara'at is something else altogether, and it's cosmetic. It's not even skin deep. It's something different. I may do a series or a video on that, because there's fascinating information about Tzara'at and why Mashiach in Jewish literature is referred to as the leper of the house of study. And the implications of that, the implications of, how could he be a leper? Why would Messiah have leprosy in any capacity? Anyway, yes, Yeshua still honored the priesthood, and that would be why he commanded the lepers that he healed to go and be inspected by the priests, among other things. Yeah, he still honored the position. In addition to that, the Pharisees that we see that are friendly with Jesus, I don't think it's correct to make a blanket statement that they were the exception. How do we know this? Well, when he's having dinner with Cornelius. Not Cornelius. Nicodemus. Good grief. What am I saying? Yeah, when he's having dinner with Nicodemus, what does Nicodemus say? He says, "We know that you come from God, because no one can do the things you're doing unless God sent him." Right? Who's this "we" that he's referring to? Understand, Nicodemus was a lawyer. He was a judge on the Sanhedrin. Right? He was a member of the Sanhedrin. I know it's treated in the show, what's it called? The Chosen, as though he's the Nasi of the Sanhedrin at the time, that he is the top rabbi of the Sanhedrin, but that is not exactly historically accurate, especially during the time of Yeshua's ministry. I'm pretty sure it would have been Shammai at that point. But be that as it may, Nicodemus was certainly part of the Pharisee part of the Sanhedrin. And when he says "we," he's talking about more than one person. So if it's a minority, it's not an enormous minority. It's not by a very large margin. So I don't think you can rightly say the exception. In any case, widespread corruption in the religious community is not simply inferred and illustrated in the Gospels. Jesus addressed it directly. In Matthew's Gospel, we find Jesus' description of the men in charge. Here's a sampling. Everything they do is done for people to see. They love the place of honor at banquets. They love their titles. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces. They neglect justice, mercy, and faithfulness. They are hypocrites. They are full of greed and self-indulgence. They're on the outside they appear righteous, but on the inside they're full of wickedness. It's interesting. I don't see anything in here judging their doctrines or their teachings. I just see, I see a lot of judging of maybe their pride or their self-importance, and then hypocrisy, them not doing what they say to do. This is not him teaching against their teachings. Rather, it's him teaching against them not following their own teachings. So it's just funny how Christians miss things like that. He says, "Lovely fellows." Jesus concludes his remarks by calling them snakes and asking them how they plan to escape hell. It's interesting that that's not exactly what he asks, and phrasing the question that way would suggest Andy Stanley is ill-informed on what Jews thought of hell in that day. But in any case, on the positive side of the ledger, well, there wasn't a positive side. Jesus considered the entire enterprise corrupt. No. Matthew 23, 1-3, what does he say? "The scribes and Pharisees are seated in the seat of Moses. Therefore that, whatever they teach you, do and obey." Matthew 5, 17-19. When we're ending in 19 and 20, what does he say? He says, "Your righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees," which means he's acknowledging the Pharisees as having righteousness. Not even just righteousness, but having a righteousness that is challenging to surpass, right? So, again, there is no positive side. Beg to differ. The Gospels beg to differ. Let's see. By the time Jesus stepped out of the Jordan River to begin his ministry, temple leaders had created a sophisticated and convoluted system of loopholes that enabled them to avoid the most inconvenient demands of the law. They were especially adept at reinterpreting and dumbing down those portions of Moses' law that would cost them financially. Consequently, those in the upper echelon of temple authority lived like kings. In Jesus' day, it was profitable to be a priest in Jerusalem. Most people don't know this, but in Jesus' day, the temple was an enormously profitable enterprise. Enormously. Here's why. There's some truth to some of that, but only mildly so. yes, the Torah teachers, the Pharisees, would have been wealthy, but not inherently by ill-gotten gains. Part of being a master of Torah is also knowing how to manage your money. Believe it or not, that is part of obedience, is being a good steward of that which the Lord has given you. Okay? I don't subscribe to prosperity gospel, but I do believe that, yes, when you're doing as Hashem wants you to do, he will bless you. So there are not inherently nefarious reasons why a Torah teacher in Yeshua's day would have been wealthy. Sure, maybe some, but certainly not all. That's a very inappropriate statement to make. See, passing the plate. That's this next section. Let's see, where are we? The temple benefited from several sources of revenue, not least of which was the temple tax. Jewish men over 20 were required to pay an annual temple tax of 1/2 shekel, equal to approximately 1.5 days' wages. This was not an enormous amount of money, but it was not limited to men living within the vicinity of the temple. The tax was required of every Jewish man regardless of where he lived. In the first century, there were millions of Jews scattered throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. An elaborate system existed for collecting, guarding, and transporting the temple tax to Jerusalem. Jewish men could pay the tax at the treasury centers located in major cities in and around the Roman Empire, or they could pay it at the temple directly. Josephus referenced one such treasury city, Nisibis, located in modern-day Turkey. The following quote gives us some idea of how much wealth was collected and transferred from Jerusalem to Jerusalem from treasury cities. For they made use of these cities as treasury, whence at a proper time, they were transmitted to Jerusalem, and many 10,000 men undertook the carriage of those donations out of fear of the ravages of the Parthians. Josephus is famous for his hyperbole. Well, yes, and I've said this before. Josephus, as an early church historian, seems to have been more interested in promoting Josephus than recording actual history. So, and I'm not challenging what he's written here, but there are certain aspects in certain other theological disputes where Josephus seems to have been less than accurate. Let's see. Yeah, Josephus is famous for his hyperbole. But even if a single 1,000 Babylonian Jews were assigned to protect the tax convoy, that would be a medium-sized army. All this to support the activity taking place on 37 acres in the Middle East of Jerusalem. In the middle of Jerusalem, not Middle East. The amount of wealth extorted out of Roman provinces and shipped to Jerusalem was so large it caused Roman governors to propose laws banning Jews in their cities from paying the tax. At one point, the Roman Senate, in an effort to keep Jewish wealth in the capital, passed a law forbidding export of silver, but the Jews in and around Rome continued to pay the tax. That was just the beginning. All right, he seems to be really appealing to people's more socialist natures, especially in this modern age. The temple tax is Torah law. That's not something the Jews made up. That's something God instated. So it's like he's building up this system in almost a negative light, like this. It's a bad thing that people were paying this tax, right? Because it made the temple so lucrative, as though the money in the temple was spent just on the frivolous things. That's just not the case. And the priests who worked in the temple were not the sole proprietors of that income. Like, they got a portion of it, but it was certainly not all for them. So, again, This all rings very anti-capitalist, like he's trying to appeal to the more socialist youth of this generation. It's just ridiculous, in my opinion. Let's see. By the 1st century, Jews were forbidden from minting their own coinage. Rabbis in charge of the temple treasury were forced to look for a foreign coin that approximated the value of a shekel or a half shekel. They chose silver coins minted in the city of Tyre. The Tyrian didrachmas and tetrachmas closely approximated the value of the ancient Jewish half shekel and shekel. In Jesus' day, the temple would only accept Tyrian coinage. That is untrue, actually. That was the purpose for the money changers, right? Because nothing with a pagan image on it could enter the temple, right? That's the purpose of the money changers, right? You give them your pagan money, and they give you money worthy of entering the temple. And this is why even we see shekel and half shekel like used throughout the Gospels, is because that's still being used at this point. This is just bad church history. Let's see. That created a problem for taxpayers and an opportunity for tax collectors. Jews traveled from all over the world to visit the temple. A few of them would be carrying Tyrian coins. To remedy this problem, tables were set up in the temple courtyard where money changers exchanged whatever currency a worshiper happened to be carrying for a Tyrian shekel. Okay, so he is working around to that. Thank goodness. Although I'm still not entirely sure about this Tyrian shekel. That I would definitely have to look into, because I'm not sure if that was actually in use by the 1st century. It might have been. Let's see. And what do you suppose determined the exchange rate? Temple authorities, of course. Worshippers had little choice but to submit to the posted rate. So in addition to taxes flowing in from all over the civilized world, the temple staff had discovered yet another way to raise revenue. Again, the temple tax is not revenue. The temple tax is mandated by the Torah. This is not something temple authorities invented. It's something that God instated. It was this practice, along with the sale of second-rate, overpriced, sacrificial animals, that drove Jesus to exercise his messianic authority in that most unforgettable manner. It's not messianic authority. He was exercising, you could say, righteous indignation. Yes, but not messianic authority, not in that capacity. And second-rate animals are not allowed into the temple. You can't. That's kind of the whole point. There's a standard of what is allowed to be brought into the temple. So yeah, he's trying very hard to paint the entire temple system as in the same light that Karl Marx viewed capitalism. In a strange twist, it was undoubtedly 30 pieces of Tyrian silver pilfered from the treasury that the chief priest used to pay off Judas. The power of politics and profit associated with the 1st century Jewish temple was the perfect storm. It was a recipe for corruption. Add religion to the mix, and it was a recipe for extraordinary hypocrisy as well, something John the Baptist and Jesus consistently pointed out and condemned. In spite of all that, the temple was still a big deal in 1st century Jewish culture. A really big deal, and Jesus claimed to be greater than the temple. That was an even bigger deal. So, no. Again, Jesus never claimed to be greater than the temple. He was explaining that the situation at hand was greater than the temple. But let's see. Yeah, we're about 40 minutes in, and that's only about half the chapter. So I'm probably going to call it there. Unimaginable. That's the next section that we're gonna read. And it looks like it just gets worse. Oh boy. In any case, I do hope you all enjoyed this. I went off on a few rants and tirades there for a minute. But most of you have probably heard me talk about that before on TikTok. So, no harm, no foul, right? In any case, I hope you all have enjoyed this, and we'll look forward to the next time. And as always, I hope you're having a blessed morning, evening, afternoon, whatever time it happens to be where you are. L'chaim.